Number 1. Afeni Badu Mohammed. A drive-through customer legally carrying a concealed firearm watched a masked figure stab a fast food manager to death in broad daylight, and the man with the gun wasn't the killer. He was trying to stop one. It was a Thursday morning, the 10th of July, in the year 2025. The sun had barely finished rising over East Point, Michigan, a modest suburb tucked just northeast of Detroit, when the morning shift began like any other at the McDonald's located at 9 Mile Road and Schroeder Avenue. For most of the employees clocking in that day, it was just another Thursday. Orders needed to be filled. Fryers needed to be checked. A drive-through line was already beginning to form. For 39-year-old Jennifer Harris, this restaurant was more than a job. It was 15 years of her life. She had started there long before she became the manager everyone in the building looked up to, and in that decade and a half, she had built a reputation that extended far beyond the counter. Coworkers describe her not merely as competent, but as maternal in the way she ran her shift, patient with new hires, quick to diffuse tension, and endlessly kind to customers, many of whom she recognized by name. She was, by every account given to reporters in the days that followed, the kind of manager who made a fast food job feel like a family. She was famous among her coworkers for one small habit. No matter how hectic the shift got, she always sent people off with the same phrase, "Have a blessed day." Harris was also a mother of 6 children. She was the anchor of Divine Restoration Ministries, a church she had attended for 18 years, where she served as an usher and was, in the words of her pastor, the first face you saw walking through the doors. Her children would later describe a woman who worked every single day to provide for them, who never had time off, and who never complained about the grind of raising 6 kids on a fast food manager's salary. That morning, Harris was working alongside a 26-year-old employee named Afeni Badu Mohammed. At some point during the shift, the two women became embroiled in an argument. Details of exactly what sparked the dispute were never fully aired publicly, but police say it centered on Mohammed's job performance. She was, according to investigators, not properly performing her assigned duties. As the shift manager, Harris made the call that any manager in her position might have made 1,000 times before. She sent Mohammed home early. To anyone who has ever worked a service job, this is an unremarkable moment. Employees get sent home constantly. It happens in every McDonald's, every Walmart, every diner in the country, almost every single day. Usually, the employee goes home, cools off, maybe vents to a friend or family member, and returns for their next scheduled shift as if nothing happened. That is not what happened here. According to the criminal complaint and later police statements, Mohammed did not go home. Instead, she got in her car and drove to a nearby park. And it was there, sitting alone with her anger, that prosecutors say she made a decision that would end a life and shatter a family of 6 children forever. She decided she was going to kill Jennifer Harris. She did not act on impulse in a moment of blind rage. She planned. She had a knife already in her vehicle, a kitchen knife, longer than 3 inches, according to authorities. She put on a mask. And then she drove back to the McDonald's she had just been sent home from. Mohammed entered through the employee entrance, the same door she would have used on any ordinary shift. Only this time, she wasn't there to work. Witnesses inside the restaurant, including, remarkably, a customer sitting in his vehicle at the drive-through window, watched as the masked figure approached Jennifer Harris and began stabbing her, again and again. What happened in the next few minutes is the kind of detail that makes this case almost impossible to forget. The customer at the drive-through window was legally carrying a concealed firearm. As he watched the attack unfold through the window in front of him, he made a split-second decision. He got out of his car, drew his weapon, and fired a single shot in an attempt to stop the assault. The bullet did not strike anyone, not Harris, not Mohammed, not any bystander. But the sound of gunfire, and the sudden appearance of an armed stranger, was enough to break the attack. Mohammed turned and ran. She didn't get far. The armed customer chased her down in the parking lot, held her at gunpoint, and kept her there until officers from the East Point Police Department arrived. When police took over, Mohammed was taken into custody without further incident. Jennifer Harris, however, had already suffered catastrophic injuries. She was rushed to a nearby hospital, where she was pronounced dead from the wounds inflicted during the attack. In the hours and days that followed, investigators began piecing together the digital trail Mohammed had left behind. They discovered that just 2 days before the killing, Mohammed had posted an emotional rant on Instagram, expressing deep frustration and dissatisfaction with her job at the restaurant. That post would go on to become a significant piece of evidence for prosecutors, offering a window into the mindset of a woman who, according to authorities, later admitted during police questioning that she had already decided to kill Harris in the moments after being sent home. Afeni Badu Muhammad was formally charged with first-degree murder, carrying a dangerous weapon with unlawful intent, and being a habitual offender in a second offense, the latter charge reflecting a prior criminal history. Given the premeditated nature of the crime, prosecutors requested, and received, an extraordinarily high bond, $25 million. It is a figure rarely seen even in murder cases, underscoring just how seriously Macomb County prosecutors viewed the calculated nature of what had happened that morning. The community's grief was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, hundreds of people gathered outside the same McDonald's where Harris had spent a decade and a half of her life, for a vigil that included a balloon release in her memory. Her daughters, Antonia and Antenisha Griffin, stood before the crowd and spoke through tears about the mother they had lost. One described how she had to stay strong for her siblings, how shutting down simply wasn't an option, because that is what their mother would have wanted. Another described Harris simply as the best mother anyone could ask for, a woman who woke up every single day to work for her children, and who, in her daughter's words, died trying to take care of us. The franchise owner of the restaurant, Yusuf Al-Qadre, addressed the crowd directly. He told mourners that Harris had worked for McDonald's for 15 years, and that she was far more than an employee to him, she was family. He recalled how, no matter who she was speaking to, whether it was him or a customer, she would always sign off the same way, "Have a blessed day." He pledged that the community supporting her would never be without family in her memory, and he committed to covering the costs of her funeral. A charitable effort, the Jennifer Harris Legacy Fund, was launched shortly afterward to help provide for her 6 children going forward, alongside a public GoFundMe campaign. Just days after the initial vigil, Harris's longtime church, Divine Restoration Ministries, organized what they called a no-violence rally, under the banner "Thou shalt not kill." The event drew a striking list of local political figures, including East Point's mayor, Michael Kleinfeld, who admitted publicly that he was shocked by the violence that had taken Harris's life, even as he expressed pride in how the community had rallied around her family. Detroit City Council President Mary Sheffield also appeared to speak at the event, a sign of just how far this single workplace tragedy had rippled outward. Perhaps the most sobering words came from East Point Police Lieutenant Alex Holish, who tried to put language to something that, in truth, defies easy explanation. "Verbal disputes," he said, "happen every single day in workplaces across the country, and they are supposed to stay that way. People argue. People get sent home. And then, in the overwhelming majority of cases, life simply goes on." What happened at that McDonald's on the 10th of July, 2025, was something else entirely. A decision made alone, in a parked car at a public park, to turn an ordinary workplace conflict into an act of premeditated violence. As of the time of this documentary, Afeni Badu Muhammad's legal case remains active, moving through Macomb County's court system. Jennifer Harris's 6 children continue to grieve a mother whose absence has left a hole not just in their family, but in an entire community that had come to depend on her quiet, steady kindness, one customer, one shift, one blessed day at a time. Number 2. Kaitlyn Conley. A young office manager wrote an anonymous letter accusing her own boyfriend's family of murder. Years later, investigators would come to believe the person who wrote that letter was the actual killer, and the case would take so many twists that it would eventually be featured on Dateline NBC not once, but twice, along with a full Hulu docuseries dedicated entirely to unraveling it. This is the case of Kaitlyn Conley, and the death of Whitesboro, New York chiropractor Mary Yoder, one of the most tangled poisoning investigations to ever emerge from small-town America. Mary Louise Yoder was born in March of 1955. By 2015, she and her husband, Bill, ran a small, well-regarded chiropractic practice together in the town of Whitesboro, in upstate New York. By all accounts, Mary had been in good health for most of her life. There was nothing in her medical history to suggest any sudden, dramatic decline was coming. Then, in July of 2015, everything changed. Mary's health began deteriorating with startling speed. What began as vague symptoms progressed rapidly, and on the 22nd of July, 2015, Mary Yoder died. Her family, unable to reconcile how quickly a healthy woman could decline and die, grew suspicious. They pushed for an investigation. An autopsy was ordered, and the results confirmed their worst fears. Mary Yoder had been poisoned. At the center of this mystery was 23-year-old Kaitlyn Conley, the receptionist and office manager at the Yoder family's chiropractic clinic. Conley's connection to the family went beyond her employment. She had been involved for years in an on-again, off-again romantic relationship with Mary's son, Adam Yoder, the same man who had helped get her the job at his parents' practice in the first place. Those close to the couple described the relationship as turbulent, at times toxic, marked by periods of intense closeness followed by conflict and separation. The investigation took an unusual turn almost immediately. An anonymous letter began circulating, accusing Adam Yoder of murdering his own mother. For a period of time, this letter successfully redirected suspicion toward Adam. Investigators began digging into his whereabouts on the day his mother was poisoned. What they found effectively cleared him. Adam had been 300 miles away, on Long Island, at the time his mother would have ingested the fatal dose. He simply could not have physically administered the poison. So detectives turned their attention to tracking down whoever had written the anonymous letter. Eventually, they traced it back to its source, and the author was Kaitlyn Conley herself. When confronted, Conley admitted she had written the letter. But she maintained that she wasn't fabricating an accusation out of thin air. She insisted that Adam had confessed the killing to her personally, and that she was simply passing that confession along to authorities anonymously. Detectives were not satisfied with this explanation. If Conley genuinely believed Adam was guilty, why go to such lengths to disguise her own identity rather than simply reporting what she claimed to know? The inconsistency kept investigators focused on Conley, and when they eventually secured a warrant to search her cell phone, what they found would become the backbone of the entire prosecution. On Conley's phone, investigators discovered multiple searches for the words poison and colchicine, a medication used in small, controlled doses to treat gout, but one that becomes severely toxic, even lethal, in overdose quantities. Digging further, they found that an email account used to purchase colchicine online, an account with a username designed to mimic Adam Yoder's own identity, had been logged into from Conley's device. Investigators traced the prepaid debit card used to make that purchase directly back to Conley as well. Armed with this evidence, prosecutors indicted Kaitlyn Conley on charges of second-degree murder, forgery, falsifying business records, and 2 counts of larceny. At trial, prosecutor Lori Lisi laid out a motive rooted not in financial gain, but in obsession and heartbreak. Conley, prosecutors argued, desperately wanted Adam Yoder back in her life, and believed that if she could eliminate his mother, a woman who, prosecutors suggested, may have stood as an obstacle in the relationship, she could somehow win Adam back. The case moved to trial in April of 2017. That first trial ended without a verdict. Jurors deliberated for 5 full days before the judge was forced to declare a mistrial after they could not reach a unanimous decision. 5 months later, Conley faced a second trial. This time, her new defense team took a different strategy, shifting suspicion away from Bill Yoder, Mary's husband, who had never been charged and always denied involvement, and focusing more heavily on Adam himself, even suggesting that Adam may have also been a target of poisoning in the months leading up to his mother's death. Adam denied all allegations under oath. When the second trial concluded in January of 2018, the jury delivered a split verdict. Conley was acquitted of the top charge of second-degree murder, but convicted of the lesser charge of first-degree manslaughter. She was sentenced to 23 years in prison. What followed was one of the more unusual chapters in modern true crime. Rather than uniformly condemning Conley, several of Mary Yoder's own sisters became convinced that the wrong person had been convicted, and they launched a public campaign advocating for Conley's innocence, even as Mary's own husband and son maintained the opposite. Conley, for her part, never stopped fighting the conviction from behind bars, telling interviewers in the years that followed, including for the Hulu docuseries Little Miss Innocent, that she did not kill Mary Yoder, and expressing bitter disappointment in a justice system she felt had failed her. Then, in a development that stunned nearly everyone following the case, a New York appellate court overturned Kaitlyn Conley's manslaughter conviction in February of 2025, nearly a decade after Mary Yoder's death. The appeals panel ruled that the search of Conley's cell phone had exceeded what the original warrant legally authorized. Because the poison and colchicine search history, along with the incriminating email account, had been obtained improperly, the court found that this evidence should never have been introduced at trial. The court likened the privacy expectations around a person's cell phone content to those of one's own home. Conley was released from custody after years behind bars. As of the most recent reporting, the case remains unresolved in its final form. Prosecutors in Oneida County have been presenting evidence to a new grand jury, and as of this telling, it remains an open question whether Kaitlyn Conley will face a third trial for the poisoning death of her boss and would-be mother-in-law, Mary Yoder. What makes this case so uniquely disturbing isn't just the method, a slow, methodical poisoning disguised as sudden illness, but the sheer audacity of the alleged cover-up. If prosecutors' theory is correct, Conley didn't simply commit the crime and hope it went undetected. She allegedly authored a letter accusing an innocent man of the very crime she is accused of committing, hand-delivering a false trail for investigators to follow, buying herself time while a family mourned a woman they believed had simply gotten sick and died. Number 3. Tyrese Haspil. A generous tech CEO forgave his young assistant after discovering he had stolen tens of thousands of dollars from him. He offered a second chance instead of pressing charges. Weeks later, that same assistant ambushed him in his own apartment building elevator, armed with a taser and a knife. This is the story of Fahim Saleh, and the man he trusted enough to forgive. Fahim Saleh was born in Saudi Arabia to Bangladeshi parents, raised in upstate New York, and educated at Bentley University in Massachusetts, where he studied computer science. By his early 30s, Saleh had built a reputation as one of the more promising young entrepreneurs in the tech world. He was best known as the co-founder and CEO of WhoKILLED, a motorcycle ride-sharing company operating in Lagos, Nigeria, and had gone on to found a Manhattan-based venture capital firm called Adventure Capital. Those who knew him describe a man who was, in the words of Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, kind, generous, and empathetic, someone who came from a close-knit immigrant family and who had genuinely positively impacted the world around him. In May of 2018, Saleh hired a young man named Tyrese Haspil as his entrepreneurial assistant. Haspil was given significant responsibility, including access to Saleh's personal and business financial records, a level of trust that, by the fall of that same year, Haspil had already begun to abuse. Beginning in September of 2018, Haspil created a PayPal account using a name deliberately designed to mimic Saleh's legitimate business transactions, allowing him to quietly funnel stolen funds into the account while simultaneously fabricating fake financial statements to disguise the theft from any routine review. This wasn't a single act of impulsive theft, it was, prosecutors would later argue, a sophisticated and sustained financial fraud scheme, one of two separate methods Haspil used to steal from his employer. Haspil resigned from his position in May of 2019. According to prosecutors, he knew at the time that Saleh would eventually uncover the embezzlement. And yet, rather than stopping, Haspil kept stealing, continuing to escalate the fraud even after leaving his job. In January of 2020, one of Haspil's schemes was finally detected and traced directly back to him. Saleh confronted his former assistant, accusing him of stealing approximately $35,000 from his company. Here is where Saleh's character becomes central to understanding just how brutal what happened next truly was. Rather than calling the police and pressing criminal charges, Saleh offered Haspil a way out. He proposed a settlement. Haspil would repay the stolen money over an agreed 2-year period, and in exchange, Saleh would not pursue criminal prosecution. Haspil agreed to the arrangement. But according to prosecutors, he paid Saleh back using more stolen money from the very PayPal fraud scheme that had not yet been detected. That scheme continued to escalate, and by the time it was finally uncovered in its entirety, Haspil had embezzled approximately $400,000 from the man who had just given him a second chance. Fearing that Saleh would eventually discover the full scope of the ongoing PayPal fraud, Haspil made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He began plotting to murder Fahim Saleh, believing that killing his former boss and mentor would prevent Saleh from ever testifying against him in a criminal proceeding. Haspil spent months planning the attack. On the 13th of July, 2020, at approximately 8:30 in the morning, Haspil followed another resident into the lobby of Saleh's Lower East Side condominium building and waited concealed inside a stairwell. He was armed with a knife and a taser, and he wore a black custom suit along with an opaque mask specifically chosen so that Saleh would not recognize his own former employee. When Saleh returned home from a morning run, Haspil followed him into the elevator, an elevator that opened directly into Saleh's private apartment. As Saleh stepped out of the elevator, Haspil immediately tasered him in the back, causing Saleh to collapse to the ground. Haspil then stabbed him multiple times in the neck and torso, killing him. In a chilling detail that speaks to the level of premeditation involved, Haspil attempted to conceal forensic evidence of the attack by using a handheld vacuum to collect the small confetti-like discs, known as AFIDs, that taser devices automatically discharge to help law enforcement trace a weapon back to its owner. The following day, Haspil returned to the crime scene to dismember Saleh's body using an electric saw and clean up evidence of the murder. Surveillance footage from a nearby hardware store captured Haspil purchasing the saw and cleaning supplies that morning. While he was in the process of dismembering the body, Saleh's cousin arrived at the apartment to check on him, prompting Haspil to briefly flee the scene to dispose of evidence in a nearby garbage can. When Saleh's cousin entered the apartment, she discovered a scene of unimaginable horror. Fahim Saleh's body, head, and limbs severed, alongside an electric saw. The medical examiner would later detail that Saleh had suffered 5 stab wounds to the neck and torso, multiple incised wounds to his arm and hand, a contusion to his forehead, and 2 lesions on his back, in addition to the dismemberment. Haspil, after returning from the hardware store, noticed a police presence outside Saleh's building and chose not to re-enter the apartment. He was arrested days later, on the 17th of July, at an Airbnb rental he had booked to celebrate his girlfriend's birthday. Haspil pleaded not guilty and was held at Rikers Island as the case moved through the court system for years, eventually landing before a jury nearly 4 years after the killing. In June of 2024, the jury found Tyrese Haspil guilty of first-degree murder, along with 2 counts of second-degree grand larceny, second-degree burglary, and additional related charges. Following the verdict, District Attorney Alvin Bragg addressed the tragedy directly, noting that Haspil had tragically cut short the life of a man who came from a close-knit immigrant family and who had followed his passions to become a genuinely successful and generous entrepreneur. A man who, even after being betrayed and stolen from, chose to extend his former assistant a second chance rather than immediately involve the police. That act of mercy, prosecutors argued, is precisely what cost Fahim Saleh his life. Haspil murdered him not out of impulsive rage, but out of a calculated fear that the very forgiveness he had already been given would eventually run out. The case drew massive national and international media attention, in part because of Saleh's prominence in the tech and startup world, and in part because of the sheer, methodical brutality of the crime. A former employee turning an act of corporate generosity into a months-long assassination plot, carried out in the very elevator of the man who had once given him a chance to make things right. Number 4. Brittany Norwood. A young sales associate was found bound and semi-conscious in a store bathroom, telling police that 2 masked men had broken in, raped her, and murdered her co-worker. Within days, investigators would determine that no masked men ever existed, and that the victim was, in fact, the killer. This is the case that would come to be known across the country simply as the Lululemon murder. On the night of the 11th of March, 2011, 28-year-old Brittany Norwood and 30-year-old Jana Truxell Murray were closing up the Lululemon Athletica store together in the upscale Bethesda Row shopping district of Bethesda, Maryland. Murray was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University, pursuing a Master of Business Administration degree. She had taken the retail job partly because it gave her the chance to meet other active, health-conscious people and to attend company seminars that complemented her studies. Norwood was a fellow sales associate at the same store. As was standard store policy at Lululemon, employees checked each other's bags for unpaid merchandise before leaving for the night. That evening, Murray discovered a pair of stolen leggings inside Norwood's bag. The 2 women left the store together at around 9:45 in the evening. Just 6 minutes later, Murray called the store manager to report what she had found. The manager told her she would deal with the matter of the stolen merchandise in the morning. Then, only a few minutes after that call, Norwood telephoned Murray. She told her that she had accidentally left her wallet inside the store and asked Murray to come back and let her in. Murray agreed. At 10:05 that night, the 2 women re-entered the Lululemon store together. Almost immediately, something went catastrophically wrong. Employees at the neighboring Apple store, separated from Lululemon only by a shared wall, heard the beginnings of a violent struggle. One Apple employee later testified that she heard a woman's voice pleading, "Talk to me. Don't do this." Surveillance footage from inside the Apple store showed employees standing near the shared wall, apparently registering the disturbance, before eventually walking away while a nearby security guard sat listening to music through headphones, unaware of what was unfolding just feet away. The following morning, the 12th of March, store manager Rachel Ertley arrived at Lululemon to open for the day. She found the front door unlocked. Merchandise was strewn across the floor. Mannequins had been knocked over and left in disarray. Frightened by what she was seeing, Ertley approached a man waiting outside the neighboring Apple store, a stranger named Ryan Hoare, and asked if he would accompany her inside. Hoare walked toward the back of the store at Ertley's request. What he found there would haunt Bethesda for years. Jana Murray was lying face down in a hallway, in a pool of her own blood. As Hoare made his way back toward the front of the store to alert Ertley, he came across a second figure, a woman bound at the wrists and ankles with plastic zip ties, a laceration across her forehead, appearing to be alive but barely conscious. That woman was Brittany Norwood. Police were called immediately. When officers arrived, they found Murray with no pulse. She had suffered a catastrophic, almost incomprehensible level of violence, Investigators would later determine she had sustained approximately 331 individual wounds, inflicted using at least 5 different weapons, including a knife and a hammer that appeared to have come from a toolbox kept inside the store. Norwood, by contrast, was found with only minor injuries: a small cut on her forehead, some scratches across her abdomen, and torn pants at the crotch, seemingly consistent with a sexual assault. She was transported to a hospital for treatment. For the first several days of the investigation, police treated Brittany Norwood as a second victim of what appeared to be a horrific armed robbery and assault. Norwood herself provided a detailed account. After she and Murray had gone back into the store to retrieve her forgotten wallet, she said, 2 men wearing dark clothing and ski masks had forced their way inside, attacked both women, and sexually assaulted them. But almost from the beginning, the physical evidence didn't line up with Norwood's story. Investigators noted that bloody footprints found throughout the store came from only 2 distinct sets of shoes: a pair of size 14 men's Reebok sneakers found abandoned inside the store, and Norwood's own shoes. Critically, those tracks never led to either exit of the building, meaning that whoever wore the men's sneakers never actually left the crime scene. Investigators also found no physical evidence that either woman had actually been sexually assaulted, despite the torn clothing. It appeared, disturbingly, that Norwood's pants had been deliberately cut to simulate an assault that never occurred. Perhaps most damning of all was a piece of forensic analysis involving blood spatter. A forensic expert testified that the blood from the small cut on Norwood's forehead had dripped in a straight, vertical line down her face, a pattern consistent with someone standing upright for an extended period, not someone lying on a bathroom floor, bound and helpless, for hours as she claimed to have been. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a piece of testimony that pointed toward motive. A co-worker, Kaitlyn Wakibu, told police that Murray had called her on the phone the night of the murder to describe discovering the stolen leggings in Norwood's bag, and that Murray had confronted Norwood about the theft directly that evening. According to Wakibu, Norwood had claimed she simply hadn't been given a receipt for the item. Within a week of the murder, on the 18th of March, 2011, Brittany Norwood was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. What prosecutors would eventually argue, and what the physical evidence increasingly supported, was a scenario in which Norwood, confronted about stealing from the store and facing potential termination or legal consequences, attacked and killed Murray inside the store that night, then spent hours meticulously staging an elaborate crime scene. She allegedly moved Murray's car to a more distant parking lot to support the fiction of an outside attacker. She wore the oversized men's sneakers to leave false footprints. She threw mops, brooms, and chairs around the store to simulate signs of a robbery. She opened the store safe and removed bags of cash. She cut a hole into her own pants to suggest sexual assault. And finally, she inflicted a series of superficial wounds on her own body, bound her own wrists and ankles with zip ties, and lay down on the bathroom floor to wait for someone to discover her the next morning as a supposed victim. At trial, held in the fall of 2011 in Montgomery County Circuit Court, Norwood's own defense attorney made an extraordinary concession. He acknowledged that Norwood had, in fact, killed Murray. His argument instead centered on degree. He contended the killing occurred during a sudden, chaotic fight rather than as a premeditated act, an argument aimed at sparing his client a first-degree murder conviction and the mandatory sentence of life without parole that conviction would carry. The jury did not agree. After deliberating for only around 21 minutes, jurors convicted Brittany Norwood of first-degree murder. At her sentencing in January of 2012, Norwood addressed the courtroom directly, telling Jana Murray's family through tears, "I am truly sorry." She said she hoped that, someday, they might find forgiveness in their hearts. Montgomery County Circuit Court Judge Robert A. Greenberg was unmoved. "You're one hell of a liar," he told her, before sentencing her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Murray's family and friends filled the courtroom that day, reading victim impact statements that described the devastating, permanent impact of her loss. Her brother, Hugh, described the day of the murder as his family's own September 11th, a date after which nothing would ever be normal again. Her father, David, said he missed his daughter more than words could express, describing her as more than a daughter, one of his 4 best friends. Norwood appealed her conviction in the years that followed, arguing that she had been improperly questioned by detectives without being read her Miranda rights, and that a police officer had been permitted to give improper testimony about a specific type of knife wound during the original trial. In 2015, Maryland's Court of Special Appeals rejected these arguments and affirmed her conviction in full. Brittany Norwood remains in prison, serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, for the murder of Jana Murray, a killing that began, according to every piece of evidence gathered, with the discovery of a single stolen pair of leggings. Number 5. Jerry Motley. An employee who told friends he was being relentlessly bullied at work brought a gun to his job one January morning, and by the time he was finished, his employer of years lay dead in his own office, shot at point-blank range while trying to physically stop the violence. This is the story of Jerry Motley Jr. and the killing of Thomas Edward Badke, the owner of Reliable Fence in Clinton Township, Michigan. On the 9th of January, 2018, 25-year-old Jerry Motley Jr. arrived for work at Reliable Fence, a fencing company located along Groesbeck Highway near 15 Mile Road. According to accounts given by Motley's family and friends in the aftermath of the shooting, Motley had been dealing with ongoing bullying at the workplace and had attempted, unsuccessfully, to resolve the situation through management. On this particular morning, according to those close to him, something in Motley simply snapped. Motley had brought a firearm with him to work that day. He confronted a coworker, 34-year-old Angelo Micheli, with whom he had reportedly been engaged in a long-running dispute. During the confrontation, Motley pulled out the gun and shot Micheli twice in the back as Micheli attempted to run away. Micheli would survive his injuries, though he required hospitalization. But Motley was not finished. He then walked directly into the office of Thomas Badke, the 61-year-old owner of Reliable Fence, and shot him at close range. According to prosecutors, Badke had attempted to physically intervene, jumping toward Motley in an effort to stop the shooting, but he was struck in the head and killed instantly. Motley attempted to flee the scene in his vehicle following the shooting, but he was apprehended a short time later after crashing into a truck and running into a nearby neighborhood. He was taken into custody and, according to authorities, provided a full confession to investigators just a few hours after the killing. Motley was charged with first-degree murder, assault with intent to murder, going armed with a dangerous weapon with unlawful intent, and 2 counts of felony firearm. He faced up to life in prison without the possibility of parole if convicted on the murder charge as written. The case moved to trial in September and October of 2019. During that first trial, Motley's defense did not dispute that he had pulled the trigger. Instead, his attorneys argued that he had been legally insane at the time of the shooting, a claim that his family and friends echoed publicly, insisting that years of workplace bullying had pushed Motley to a psychological breaking point on that January morning. The jury rejected the insanity defense and found Motley guilty on all counts. In November of 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing, Badke's daughter-in-law, Chelsea Badke, addressed Motley directly in a statement that captured the family's sense of profound betrayal. She recalled that Motley had once come to their family home, laughed and shared drinks with them, after having already purchased the very gun he planned to use to kill their family and friend. She told him that spending the rest of his life in a cell would never bring her father-in-law back, but that it was, in her words, the most we will get. But the legal saga was far from over. In 2023, Motley's original conviction was vacated after a review determined that his trial counsel had been constitutionally ineffective, a legal finding that entitled him to an entirely new trial, for years after he had already been sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Motley was retried in the spring of 2025. Once again, his defense argued that he had been legally insane at the time he killed Badke and shot Micheli. And once again, prosecutors presented the same core evidence, the confession, the eyewitness accounts, and the methodical nature of the attack, shooting a fleeing coworker in the back before walking calmly into an office to kill the business's owner at close range. On the 20th of June, 2025, following a trial that lasted more than 2 weeks, a Macomb County jury once again found Jerry Motley guilty on all counts: first-degree premeditated murder, assault with intent to murder, going armed with a dangerous weapon with unlawful intent, and 2 counts of felony firearm. The jury once again rejected his insanity defense. On the 7th of August, 2025, Macomb County Circuit Court Judge Matthew Sabua sentenced Motley for a second time to mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole on the murder charge, along with additional consecutive sentences on the remaining counts. Macomb County Prosecutor Peter Lucido did not mince words following the second conviction, calling it a cold, calculated, and premeditated murder. He praised the persistence of his trial team in securing justice for the victims a second time, despite the years of delay caused by the overturned original conviction. Justice has finally been served, Lucido said in a public statement. Despite the delays and the defendant's claims of insanity, the jury saw the truth. The case of Jerry Motley stands as a stark reminder that workplace grievances, real or perceived, can, in rare but devastating instances, escalate into calculated acts of lethal violence, and that the wheels of justice, even when delayed by years of appeals and retrials, can still ultimately turn to hold a killer accountable. Number 6. Raissa Kengne. A woman who had filed a nearly 600-page federal lawsuit against her former employer went on a targeted shooting spree across 2 buildings in the heart of Atlanta, hunting down the very people named as defendants in her own legal filings, before fleeing to the airport in a taxicab, asking the driver to take her first to her lawyer's home. This is the story of Raissa Kengne and the August 2022 shooting spree that shook Atlanta's Midtown district. Kengne, then 34 years old, had previously worked as an audit manager at BDO USA, a major accounting firm with offices in Atlanta. According to her own social media postings later uncovered by investigators, she had left that position in November of 2021. She had also lived at a condominium complex called 1280 West, located in the Midtown neighborhood. In the months leading up to the shooting, Kengne had grown convinced that she was the target of a coordinated campaign of retaliation. In May of 2022, filing largely on her own without an attorney, she submitted a sprawling federal lawsuit in Fulton County Superior Court, alleging that her former employer at BDO and the property management company overseeing her condominium building, Beacon Management Services, had conspired together to blacklist her from future job opportunities, to interfere with her unemployment benefits, to block her from receiving pandemic-era homeowner assistance fund benefits, and to prevent her from accessing food assistance through the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. The lawsuit alleged, among other things, retaliation, harassment, intimidation, threats, burglary, and computer hacking, stemming from a workplace dispute in which Kengne claimed she had flagged a significant deficiency during an audit that her superiors chose to disregard. In July, that lawsuit, filed pro se, without legal representation, was transferred to federal court, where it was ultimately dismissed. On the 22nd of August, 2022, Kengne allegedly put a violent plan into motion. She began at the 1280 West condominium complex, the same building where she lived, opening fire and killing 60-year-old Michael Shinners, the building manager employed by Beacon Management Services, and wounding another man, Michael Horn, the company's chief building engineer, who was shot in the chest and left in critical condition. From there, according to police, Kengne moved to a second location, an office building roughly down the road, tied to the same property management company, as well as connected to her former employer BDO. There, she allegedly shot and killed 41-year-old Wesley Freeman, her former supervisor at BDO, whom she had once described in a since-uncovered LinkedIn post as the laziest manager I have had the displeasure of working for. Freeman, like Shinners, was named as a defendant in Kengne's sprawling federal lawsuit. During the office building attack, an employee named Miss Steed described a terrifying encounter with Kengne. According to Steed's later trial testimony, Kengne pushed against a locked door before shooting through it. Then, after a tense standoff, tracked Steed down, held her at gunpoint, and demanded the key fobs used to access the building. Steed testified she was shaking too hard from fear to open the key fob storage box. Remarkably, Kengne simply turned and walked out without pressing the issue further. A recording of Steed's frantic call to 911, capturing her describing being shot at through a bathroom door, was later played for jurors at trial. Following the shootings, Kengne fled the scene by taxi, first directing the driver to a home on Robin Hood Road in the Ansley Park neighborhood, a residence she reportedly told the driver belonged to her attorney. From there, she requested a ride to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. She was located and arrested by ATF task force officers at the airport's international terminal later that day. Kengne was indicted on a lengthy list of charges, including 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of murder, 5 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, false imprisonment, attempted burglary, and 3 counts of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Investigators publicly stated that they did not believe the shootings were random. Rather, they characterized them as a deliberate, organized, targeted attack against specific individuals connected to Kengne's grievances. The road to trial, however, was far from straightforward. In mid-2024, a court-ordered psychological evaluation determined that Kengne was not competent to stand trial. Prosecutors did not challenge that finding, and a Fulton County Superior Court judge officially ruled her incompetent at that time, delaying the case for further treatment and evaluation. Eventually, Kengne was found competent to proceed, and her trial began in the spring of 2026. Cameras and audio recording were barred from the courtroom by the presiding judge, a detail that added to the intense public interest surrounding the case. Kengne's defense team argued that she should be found not guilty by reason of insanity, pointing to evidence of significant mental illness, including an eventual acknowledgement by the state itself that Kengne suffered from schizophrenia. An associate of Kengne's, whistleblower attorney Michael Sullivan, testified that during the 7 weeks he represented her prior to withdrawing from her case, he found her sophisticated and very intelligent, even as he ultimately chose to end the professional relationship. Prosecutors, however, argued that regardless of her diagnosis, Kengne had demonstrably understood that her actions were both morally and legally wrong, pointing specifically to the fact that she fled the scene immediately after the shootings, discarded her weapon, and attempted to escape the country via the international terminal at the airport, rather than remaining at the scene or turning herself in. After a trial lasting roughly a week, the jury reached its verdict in a little over an hour of deliberation. Guilty but mentally ill on all 14 charges, including murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis addressed the verdict afterward, expressing gratitude to the jury and describing the case as a stark reminder of the deadly consequences that can occur when someone in the midst of a serious mental health crisis has ready access to a firearm. Judge Shukura Ingram sentenced Kengne to 2 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 50 years in prison. Following the sentencing, surviving victim Michael Horn's daughter, Allison Page, told reporters that while she felt justice had been served, she found no real sense of victory in the outcome. She noted, with evident empathy, that Kengne's own family was, in a sense, grieving as well, losing a loved one not to death, but to a life sentence shaped by both violence and untreated mental illness. The Midtown Atlanta shooting spree remains one of the most chilling illustrations of what can happen when workplace grievances become entangled with a spiraling mental health crisis, and when a paper trail of lawsuits and legal filings becomes, tragically, a literal target list. Number 7. Mason Trever Toney. A construction worker helped his down-on-his-luck friend land a job on his crew. Weeks later, that same friend stabbed him to death at a highway job site with a masonry trowel, then draped a brand-new American flag over his dying body. This is the story of William Stephen Knight and Mason Trever Toney. On the 20th of January, 2020, 28-year-old Mason Trever Toney arrived for work at a construction site located along Florida's Turnpike near Orlando, close to where the highway intersects with the Beachline Expressway and South Orange Blossom Trail. Toney had recently gone through a difficult stretch, and it was his friend and co-worker, 28-year-old William Stephen Knight, who went by his middle name, Stephen, who had helped him get back on his feet by securing him a position on the construction crew. According to Knight's own mother, Julia, her son had made a habit in recent weeks of getting up early each morning specifically to pick Toney up for work, a small act of loyalty and friendship extended to someone who needed it. That morning, Toney and Knight were reportedly traveling together between 2 different sections of the job site when an argument broke out between them. According to witnesses and the arrest affidavit later filed by the Orange County Sheriff's Office, the dispute centered on politics. Co-workers described Knight as an outspoken, proud supporter of then-President Donald Trump. Toney, by contrast, was described by colleagues as holding strong anti-government beliefs, reportedly very outspoken about his beliefs that the government is bad and out to get him. The argument escalated with shocking speed. Other workers at the site told investigators they heard Knight yelling for help. When they ran toward the sound, they discovered Toney standing over Knight, repeatedly stabbing him with a trowel, a common masonry hand tool not designed as a weapon, but wielded here with lethal, repeated force. When witnesses attempted to intervene, Toney reportedly turned on them as well, approaching the group while brandishing what they believed to be a knife, and shouting that they were terrorists. Deputies who responded to the scene, called in shortly before 10:45 that morning, found William Stephen Knight's body lying next to an excavator. In a detail that would generate national headlines, someone had placed a brand new American flag over the side of Knight's body, a flag that, according to investigators, did not belong to anyone who worked at the site. Toney fled the scene in a construction company truck before ditching it and continuing his escape. He was later apprehended after crashing a stolen white pickup truck in neighboring Brevard County, following a police pursuit. He was arrested that evening without further incident and taken into custody, where the Orange County Sheriff's Office had labeled him armed and dangerous in the hours leading up to his capture. Mason Trever Toney was charged with first-degree murder. The case drew significant national media attention, in large part due to the politically charged nature of the alleged motive, a killing seemingly rooted in a dispute between a supporter and an opponent of the sitting president, playing out not in a political rally or an online forum, but on a quiet highway construction site between 2 men who, by every account, had been genuine friends outside of work. Knight's family spoke to local media in the aftermath, describing a young man defined by kindness, humor, and generosity, someone who, in his father Bill's words, would help anybody. His mother recalled how her son had made a point in his final days of helping his struggling friend find steady work, a small act of compassion that would ultimately cost him his life. The case took years to reach its conclusion, moving slowly through the Florida court system. When it finally came to trial, Toney's defense pursued a claim of insanity, arguing that his mental state at the time of the killing rendered him not criminally responsible for his actions. On the 7th of February, 2025, more than 5 years after the killing, a judge presiding over a non-jury trial found Mason Trever Toney not guilty by reason of insanity. The verdict brought a controversial and, for many observers, unsatisfying close to a case that had once dominated national headlines as a symbol of America's deepening political divisions. What had begun as an act of friendship, one man helping another find work during a difficult period of his life, ended instead with a brutal killing on the side of a highway, an American flag draped over a dying man's body, and a legal resolution that left the underlying question of accountability legally settled, even as it remained, for many, morally unresolved. Number 8.
Ernesto Hernandez Avalos.
A landscaper criticized his day laborer for working too slowly. Within moments, that laborer had turned a garden shovel into a murder weapon, and when police arrived to take him into custody, he reached for something even worse. This is the case of Woo Sung Park, a 45-year-old landscaper, and the day laborer he hired to help him on a routine job. On the morning of the 29th of January, 2007, 27-year-old Ernesto Hernandez Avalos, a day laborer from Santa Ana, California, was working for Park in the backyard of a residential property on Woods Trail in the city of Irvine. This was not the first time Avalos had worked for Park. The two men had collaborated on a handful of previous landscaping jobs, suggesting at least some prior working relationship, however brief. Shortly after 11:30 that morning, according to prosecutors, Park began criticizing Avalos, complaining that he was working too slowly. It was, on its face, an unremarkable moment, the kind of workplace criticism given by supervisors to workers in virtually every industry, every single day, all across the world. Avalos's reaction was anything but ordinary. According to witness accounts and the subsequent prosecution, Avalos became enraged by the criticism. As Park turned his back, Avalos struck him in the back of the head with a shovel, immediately knocking the victim to the ground. As another worker who had witnessed the initial assault ran to find someone who could call for emergency help, Avalos continued the attack, striking Park an additional 6 or 7 times with the shovel. Irvine police officers arrived at the scene with remarkable speed. When they confronted Avalos, they ordered him to drop the shovel. According to police accounts, he complied, momentarily. But rather than surrendering, Avalos then reached for a second tool at the job site, a pickaxe, which he grabbed in what authorities described as an apparent attempt to finish killing Park even as law enforcement stood present at the scene. Avalos was taken into custody at the scene of the crime. Woo Sung Park did not survive his injuries. Avalos was charged with murder, along with a sentencing enhancement for the personal use of a deadly weapon during the commission of the crime. The case moved through the Orange County court system, and in 2010, a jury convicted Ernesto Hernandez Avalos of 1 felony count of murder. He faced a maximum possible sentence of 26 years to life in state prison, and was ultimately sentenced accordingly, entering the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. The killing of Woo Sung Park has since been cited repeatedly in true crime retrospectives examining workplace violence, in large part because of how starkly it illustrates the terrifying unpredictability of sudden, disproportionate rage. A single comment about work pace, delivered by an employer to a worker he had hired multiple times before, ending not in an argument or a firing, but in a fatal beating carried out with whatever tools happened to be within arm's reach. Number 9. Matthew Beck. An accountant walked into his workplace one March morning, armed with a handgun and a butcher knife, and systematically hunted down 4 of his supervisors, one after another, through the halls of a state government building, before chasing his final target into a parking lot, where the man fell to his knees, raised his hands, and begged for his life. This is the story of the Connecticut lottery shooting of 1998, one of the earliest and most infamous workplace mass shootings in modern American history, a case whose aftermath directly reshaped gun legislation across an entire state. On the morning of the 6th of March, 1998, 35-year-old Matthew Beck reported to work as usual at the headquarters of the Connecticut Lottery Corporation in Newington, Connecticut, where he was employed as an accountant. Beck had recently returned from a leave of absence and had moved back in with his family, who were reportedly worried enough about his mental state and access to firearms that they had previously contacted police, fearing he might be suicidal. About 30 minutes after clocking in that morning, Beck pulled out a semi-automatic handgun and began a methodical, room-by-room attack on the lottery's senior leadership. He first walked into the office of Michael Logan, the company's information services chief. Beck shot Logan, then further attacked him with a butcher knife he had also brought into the building. From there, Beck moved to confront 38-year-old Linda Mlynarczyk, the lottery's chief financial officer, who was seated, waiting to meet with him. According to a witness who was present in the room, Beck raised his gun, pointed it directly at Mlynarczyk, and said, "Bye, bye," before shooting her 3 times. Beck then shot 40-year-old Rick Rubelman, the vice president of operations. Finally, Beck turned his attention to the man at the very top of the organization, 54-year-old Otho Brown, the lottery's president and CEO. As Brown attempted to flee, running through the parking lot and urging other panicked employees around him to head for the safety of the nearby woods, Beck gave chase. Brown eventually stumbled and fell onto his back in the gravel parking lot. According to a law enforcement source who later described the scene, Brown raised his hands and begged for his life, saying, "Don't kill me, don't kill me." Beck's chilling response, according to that same source, was simply, "Or, shut up," before shooting Brown at point-blank range. Brown's last words to his fleeing coworkers, urging them towards safety even as he himself was gunned down, were reportedly, "Keep running." After killing all 4 of his supervisors, Matthew Beck turned the gun on himself, ending his own life at the scene. No trial would ever take place. The case ended not with a courtroom verdict, but with the shooter's suicide immediately following the massacre. The Connecticut lottery shooting sent shockwaves through the state and the nation, both for the sheer brutality of a workplace shooting targeting an entire tier of senior leadership, and for what came next. Because Beck's own family had previously attempted to alert authorities to their fears about his mental state and access to firearms, fears that, under the laws of the time, gave police no clear legal mechanism to actually remove weapons from a potentially dangerous individual, the tragedy became the direct catalyst for groundbreaking legislative change. In its aftermath, Connecticut passed the nation's first-ever gun seizure law, formally granting law enforcement the authority to confiscate firearms from individuals determined to be a danger to themselves or others, even without an underlying criminal charge. That law would go on to serve as a model referenced in later red flag legislation debates across the entire United States in the decades that followed. Criminal profilers who later studied the case described Beck's rampage as chillingly methodical rather than impulsive, a calculated act, room by room, name by name, that amplified the horror precisely because of how deliberate it clearly was. Labor law experts pointed to the tragedy as a pivotal moment in broader national conversations about workplace security protocols, and how employers might better identify and respond to escalating employee grievances before they turn violent. More than a quarter-century later, the Connecticut lottery shooting remains a grim touchstone in the history of American workplace violence, a case in which one employee's private breaking point erased an organization's entire senior leadership team within the span of a single, horrifying half-hour. Number 10. Domenic Micheli. A man fired from his job at a Nashville fitness center vanished for over a year, resurfacing in Oregon, then getting arrested at a security checkpoint near the White House, all while posting increasingly bizarre messages online calling himself the Son of God. Then, weeks after escaping a Washington, D.C. halfway house, he drove back to Tennessee and hunted down the man who had fired him, armed with a hatchet. This is the case of Joel Pavola and Domenic Micheli. 46-year-old Joel Pavola ran a fitness studio called The Balance Training, located in a shopping center in the Belmead community near Nashville, Tennessee. Pavola was married and the father of 5 children. Roughly 14 months before the events that would end his life, Pavola had made the decision to fire an employee, 36-year-old Domenic Micheli, who had worked at the gym as a fitness trainer. In the time following his termination, Micheli's life took an increasingly erratic and troubling turn. Sources familiar with him told reporters that prior to his firing, Micheli had been well-liked, intelligent, and professionally competent, working as a fitness trainer at multiple locations around Nashville. But something changed. He began traveling around the country in what one report described as a wandering, multi-state journey, appearing in Oregon in August of 2017, and eventually resurfacing in Washington, D.C. In April of 2018, Micheli was arrested by the United States Secret Service after driving to a security checkpoint near the White House and refusing to move his vehicle when instructed, an incident that resulted in charges for unlawful entry. As his federal case moved forward in Washington, a psychologist evaluated Micheli and controversially determined that he was currently competent to stand trial, describing him during the assessment as alert, cooperative, and very pleasant, even while acknowledging he had offered information that could potentially be interpreted as irrational. The evaluation concluded that whatever issues might have been present at the time of his White House arrest appeared to have abated, and a judge found no reasonable basis for further psychiatric evaluation. Micheli was placed in a halfway house in Washington, D.C. under pretrial supervision, with his federal case still pending. Then, in the days before the 4th of June, 2018, Micheli reportedly escaped from that Washington, D.C. halfway house. In the window of time between his escape and what came next, according to a subsequent lawsuit filed by Pavola's widow, Micheli posted a series of bizarre and deeply alarming messages to Facebook. In one post cited in that lawsuit, dated the 26th of May, 2018, Micheli reportedly declared himself the Son of God and warned that there would be no mercy shown after this post. On the morning of the 4th of June, 2018, Micheli was captured on security cameras pacing back and forth inside the parking garage beneath the Balance Training Center, seemingly working up the resolve for what he was about to do. He was carrying at least one hatchet, and possibly a second bladed weapon. Reports differed as to whether it was a second hatchet, a meat cleaver, or a large knife. Joel Pavola was inside the gym at the time, actively assisting clients with a workout, when Micheli entered. According to Metro Nashville police spokesman Don Aaron, Micheli brutally, savagely attacked Pavola at the front of the business. Pavola died before he could be transported to a hospital for treatment. Micheli fled the scene in his vehicle, an older model silver Toyota. Roughly an hour after the attack, he was captured on surveillance footage limping into an urgent care facility in Gallatin, Tennessee, roughly 35 miles from the scene of the killing, apparently seeking treatment for a leg injury sustained during the attack. When staff informed him that the facility did not have suture kits available, Micheli left within about 5 minutes. He was then spotted on security camera footage purchasing medical supplies at a nearby drugstore before disappearing again. A manhunt spanning multiple states and law enforcement agencies followed. More than 24 hours after the killing, a concerned motorist driving on Interstate 65 near Bowling Green, Kentucky, recognized Micheli's vehicle from news coverage of the search and alerted authorities. Kentucky State Police stopped the car and arrested Micheli without incident. He was held in the Warren County Regional Jail as a fugitive, pending extradition back to Tennessee to face a criminal homicide charge. Following his arrest, Micheli reportedly gave detectives a detailed statement admitting to the killing. Investigators who searched his vehicle found a hatchet, a large knife, and blood evidence inside. In the aftermath of the killing, a forensic psychologist who reviewed Micheli's public social media activity told reporters that his posts displayed textbook signs of untreated psychosis in the period leading up to the murder, describing his repeated online claims of being the Son of God as classic delusions of grandeur. The psychologist suggested that individuals experiencing this kind of grandiose delusional thinking often gravitate toward the person they perceive as holding the most power or authority in their life, which may help explain why Micheli's rage, after more than a year of erratic wandering, ultimately refocused on the man who had once had the authority to fire him. A source close to both Micheli and Pavola told local reporters that concerns about Micheli's deteriorating mental state and behavior had reportedly been raised to multiple agencies in different states well before the killing occurred. Warnings that, in hindsight, went unheeded. In the wake of the murder, Pavola's widow, Lana, filed a federal wrongful death lawsuit against the Washington, D.C. Department of Corrections and the halfway house facility from which Micheli had allegedly escaped just weeks before the killing. The lawsuit alleged negligence, pointing to what her attorneys described as a documented pattern of nearly 300 escapes investigated at that same halfway house facility since 2016, and arguing that the concerning Facebook posts Micheli made in the days following his escape could have been used by authorities to locate and reapprehend him before he ever reached Tennessee. Micheli pleaded not guilty to the murder charge, and his criminal case proceeded through the Tennessee court system even as the civil litigation over his earlier escape moved forward separately in federal court. The killing of Joel Pavola remains a haunting case study in the collision of untreated mental illness, institutional failure, and workplace grievance, a killing carried out with a hatchet by a man who, more than a year after being fired, had drifted across state lines, brushed up against federal law enforcement at the doorstep of the White House, and ultimately found his way back to the one person whose decision, over a year earlier, seemed to mark the beginning of his unraveling.